In this video, we're covering the #1 problem facing nonprofit leaders. Let's talk about it.
Hey, we are Ted and Lisa Snyder, nonprofit consultants, because we believe a better world needs healthier nonprofits.
And nonprofits run into a lot of different issues, from leadership to volunteers, to staff members, funding, resources, all of that stuff. But there is one overarching problem that we see time and time again in our work consulting with nonprofits, and it's this idea of the J-curve.
This one issue impacts every single area, from fundraising to volunteers to leading staff to helping the people that you're trying to help. Pretty much every issue that we see within nonprofits in some capacity comes back to this one thing. And it's something that a lot of them don't even realize is happening. But once you see it, you just can't unsee it within the organization.
You start to see it everywhere.
Now, we'll be reading something about a nonprofit. We will be talking to a nonprofit leader. And inevitably, Ted and I will look at each other and say, That's the J-curve.
That's a J-curve.
So we want to let you know about this, because if you can figure this out and start seeing it within your organization, you can also start fixing it within your organization. So let's talk about it.
Cool. So a J-curve specifically refers to this idea that when you're going to see some long-term success, it usually starts with a little bit of a negative dip for a while, because as you're putting in resources, just like if you're investing money or anything, you put in some resources, time, energy, money, something, you see a little bit of a decrease for a section, for a season, and then things will start to improve and go really, really crazy. What's a good example of that?
Great example is if you have a team that you've been running on your own for a while and you start thinking, I'm going to bring in some volunteers for this. Initially, what you're going to see is the amount of time that it takes you working with these volunteers. You're going to be like, man, I brought in people to help me with this, but I just feel like I'm overwhelmed. It's too much time. I'm too busy. The training is taking too long. I just don't know if I'm going to have it.
It takes 5 hours to do it. Used to take me 1.
Yeah. And about the time that you hit that bottom part where you're starting to question, is the bottom falling out? Should I just bail? I could just give up. Like, what are we doing here? A lot of times people think I'm going to make this change and things are just going to it's going to be flat for a while and then go up. But really,
it dips.
It dips. But then after the volunteers start working and they get the hang of it and the systems are in place, then suddenly you start to see, whoa, I freed up a whole bunch of time for myself. I have all these people working for me, and now they're starting to train up their own volunteers. And now I have all this extra time and all these extra people hours. And I just can't even believe how much the team is getting done. And if you really work it well, it could be to a spot where it's like, oh, I don't even have to touch the team anymore. I keep in touch with 1 or 2 leaders and everything just functions without me. And that's an example of the J-curve. When it comes to doing something new with fundraising, maybe your goal has been very, very, very grant focused for a long time. And you start thinking, you know what? The vast majority of donations actually come from individual donors, and we want to get in on those. Well, that first amount of time of digging in, learning how to communicate, talking about the money, that initial, I need to build the relationships and really work on this one area that we haven't done previously. That's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of knowledge. It's going to take a lot of learning new resources. It's going to feel incredibly uncomfortable. And you're going to wonder, am I doing this right? I feel like I'm just messing up. I'm just not sure what to do next. But as you start to get the hang of it, there's a lot more room for growth on the other side of it. But you have to go through that little part, the dip, that in our minds, we know it's a dip, but when we are in it, even in our own lives, after teaching this principle time and time again,
it feels
we look
more
at
like
each other, we're like, we're dying.
It feels more like a cliff,
like
you're falling off of instead of a momentary dip. And it's tough, like you're in it. And this is why it's such a big problem for nonprofits, is because you want to, like in nonprofit, when things are going down, it feels so awful that you do basically everything that you can. Your body is fighting against you to power through that dip. So it becomes a huge problem, because now you're trying to do everything you can to avoid the down part, which means you never get to see the up part.
Yes, and if you bail out too early, you never get to see the growth. But the dangerous part of the J-curve isn't bailing out too early. A lot of people think, okay, so the problem with the J-curve is if I bail out here,
you don't get to see the results.
Then I don't see the results. But that's not actually it.
This is the thing that we see way more often, and it's reverse J curves. There's like a negative J curve where you go for a short-term solution to fix something, which ends up creating a really big problem that exponentially increases and becomes a negative J curve. So a really great example of this is we need more finances, right? So we're going to blast out a giant email and we're going to hit social media and we're going to do this big giant push to get a bunch of extra money right now. And you're like, wow, that worked really great. Let's do it again next week. Let's do it again next week. Let's do it again next week. First of all, you're going to start to see it stop being as effective. But then what happens? You do that too much, you start bothering people. They start unsubscribing from your email list, blocking you on social media. And now it becomes a problem where you don't even have the ears of people who used to support you. Now they're gone and you're in a negative free fall of financial problem because you don't have an ability to fundraise anymore.
Yeah. I was talking with a woman recently who has supported the same nonprofit for years. And she recently stopped supporting the nonprofit. And I was like, why? Like, as long as I've known you, you have supported the same nonprofit. You've been like, this is what I do.
Financially.
Financially. Yep. Yeah. I've been supporting the nonprofit financially. And she got to a point where she's like, well, yeah, but early on, this is what the giving stuff kind of looked like. And it was fun to be a part of. She said, but recently they started to enjoy they did kind of a out of nowhere giving ask, and they got a bump financially. And once they saw that bump financially, they increased their giving asks. So instead of it being like once every 3 to 6 months, it became once a month. And then it hit a spot where it was almost weekly. She is being asked to give just a little bit more. And she just said, like, I just couldn't sustain it. I couldn't keep doing it. They stopped telling stories about what was happening within the organization.
It just started making me feel guilty.
They just started making me feel guilty. And so I went and found a different organization to give to. And what happened there was that little initial bump that caused just this massive dip to the point where people just started not listening to the organization. We've seen this happen on volunteer teams too, where a leader will say, oh man, I need to start this new volunteer team. But instead of going and finding new volunteers
and going through the
bad
awkward
part, going through the lots of conversations, don't know if anyone wants to help me.
Tons of rejection.
I'm not sure how to talk about this. People are rejecting me, but I'm going to sit on the other side. They say, I already run 3 volunteer teams. I'm just going to ask my most committed volunteers
to do a little more
and join a 4th volunteer team. Not that they're on all 3, but just 3 volunteer teams. They're like, sometimes I'm going to ask the top volunteer from each one and have them just volunteer a little more on this new team. And in the short term, they might get that bump of, oh man, I have these awesome people on this 4th team. It's going really great. And then they just keep leaning on them and it feels really good. But then pretty soon those volunteers start to think, you told me it was for a season and now I'm stuck in this additional role. You asked me to volunteer for a short amount of time for extra, but now it's been 3 months, 6 months. And rather than just losing the volunteer from the one team and having them step back, that volunteer leader is now losing trust with the volunteers. And the volunteers are leaving all of their teams. Right. I can't tell you how many times we've seen this. And it seems like such a small thing, but the leader is so afraid of going through that little dip that they will avoid it to the point where they will take a positive little dip at the expense of everything else in their organization. And what happens is that starts with like one negative J curve and then another J curve and another J curve.
You're trying to recover from that free fall. So then you go, well, maybe I can do this momentary fix to make it better. And it feels a little bit better for a second. And then it gets worse and it just completely spirals out of control.
Yeah, there have been organizations that go from being super, super healthy to just spiraling to the point where they're almost unrecognizable. And it doesn't take long. Once you get on this thing where the short-term high is worth it no matter what the cost, and we're just going to keep pursuing that short-term thing that's going to make us feel better for a week or two, it becomes very, very, very hard to get out of that spiral, partly because the minute that you go back and try and fix it, that first dip it not only feels worse, it is worse.
It's the lowest you've ever been.
The lowest you've ever been because you were here, you went down a bunch, and now you have to dip, which means you have to go to a point that you may have never even experienced as an organization previously. And that can be really, really difficult.
It's scary. I mean, that's kind of what I feel like the J curve is all based on fear and like being able to think ahead and say, okay, this is maybe a short-term gain, but this is ultimately a long-term fail. So we need to avoid that and do the really uncomfortable, scary thing right now in order to get to the success.
Yeah. As a leader, another place that we see this often is in a willingness or unwillingness to have the hard conversations with staff members.
Or volunteers.
But those conversations where you say this is going to be a hard conversation and it's going to be kind of miserable for a bit, but if we get to the other side, the organization and our relationship is going to be better and healthier, and we're going to be able to move forward. That's a lot better than saying short term, I'm just going to ignore it. Because eventually the little issues that you know are there, you can pretend they're not there, but you know they're there. Even if you're lying to yourself, you know that they are there and they're not going to get smaller over time.
Can I share an example?
Yeah.
So we were working with a nonprofit who had a person on one of their volunteer teams that their attitude was just awful. Like they would come in, their attitude was so bad that it just made everybody not want to be there. But the leader, instead of having a really hard it was going to be a hard conversation of saying like, hey, I know you're here volunteering, you're giving your time, you're doing it for free, we're not paying you, but you're fired. Instead of having that hard conversation and figuring out a way to handle it and handle it once and for all, they just kind of like skirted around it and avoided it. And what it had done over time is it created this negative J curve where it momentarily relieved the pressure of this problem, but it didn't actually fix the problem because they didn't remove the person from their volunteer team. So then the person still showed up, which made people, I don't like this. But then every time they had this conversation, like beating around the bush, they made it harder to have the real conversation in the future. So it started getting completely out of control to the point where there were only a few people left on the volunteer team that were willing to deal with this person. And ultimately, this person was covering a large role on the team too, because everybody else had left. So they had to have the really hard conversation and then basically cut their volunteer team down by a third, because they were like one of 3 people who were even serving at that point. So then it really hurt because it's like, oh my gosh, now we only have 2 volunteers. So it was this, they had gone into a negative J curve. Then they went lower than they had ever been before with a super low volunteer team now. But because they had removed that really just kind of nasty attituded person from that environment, all of a sudden, wouldn't you know it, people were like, hey, I have a friend who could be on this volunteer team. And they started like bringing people. And so they actually worked their way out of it. And over a pretty short period of time, once they removed that problem person and had that hard conversation, they did it with care. They did it with as much grace as possible. But sometimes it needs to be done. Yeah. Once they started doing it, we saw that team like grow, and the skill that was coming into that team started to really take off. And you could tell that it made a huge difference to go through that really uncomfortable lowest point to make a positive J curve.
Yeah, they ended up with more leaders on that team, like volunteer leaders helping to lead other volunteers on that team than they originally had just volunteers. Granted, they only had like 3 or 4 people, but they ended up with like a few solid leaders who were then helping to bring in other volunteers and grow that team. And it didn't take that long. It was a matter of weeks that
But I mean, the potential leaders that could have been on that team were all really intimidated by the issue. They were like, I don't want to deal with this person. I don't know how to deal with this person. So the staff leader had to have that, hey, this is my responsibility to take care of this. And as a leader in the organization, it's your responsibility to see that J curve. You are in a position of leadership to be able to have like an eagle eye view of everything. To be able to see like, hey, we're doing a positive J curve thing where we're going to dip for a little bit, or we're in a negative J curve. And it's your responsibility as the leader to say, what can I do to get us moving in a positive direction, or to encourage people and motivate people through the low part?
Yes. Now, if you're someone who thinks that you might be in a J curve, but you're having a hard time seeing it, this is where having the right people around you makes a huge difference, because they're able to see things that you might not be able to see, including ways that you might naturally lean or prefer.
Mm.
And one of the things that this makes me think of is the vanity metrics. We actually have a video about this that we recommend. But what we see a lot with J curves is a lot of times those little, I'm going to bump this up, is because there's some sort of metric that makes the leader, the top leader, or someone in the middle feel good. And so they're willing to do whatever is needed in order to get that little boost before they go down on the other side. And as leaders, if you're someone who's motivated by certain numbers in your organization, we recommend that you watch that video because that'll help you identify some of what you're paying attention to and where your blind spots for J curves might be. So we'll see you over there.